panels are, they're all ready to go. So welcome to everybody. We're happy to see this many people be here. My name is Janice Warm, and I'm the moderator today. And our session is called I Don't Know That, and Lost Treasures Found in Famous Council Bluffs Museums. Our first speaker today is Tom Emmett, sorry, I can't read. Tom Emmett, the curator of the Dodge House. So a little bit of his bio. He's a native of Colorado and is passionate about history. Holds a bachelor and master's degree in history, as well as a master's in divinity. As a homeowner just up the street from the historic General Dodge House, he is passionate about local history. In his free time, he reads, plays the cello, collects antique maps, works on his Spanish, and shares produce from his vegetable garden. Tom currently serves as the executive director of the historic General Dodge House and is very proud to share our locals' remarkable stories. So, Tom.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A hearty good morning and a thank you for Mr. Bennett and all of the other folks that have made this well-organized and thoughtful conference possible. What a blessing it has been. Now, with regards to the General Dodge House, there's been a lot written about General Dodge. Two major biographies, numerous writings that he did himself, an autobiography that has not been published but should be and will be. And so today I thought I might entertain you with some selected anecdotes that you might not otherwise be aware of. But first, let's have a quick reminder of who General Dodge is and enjoy some pictures of the Dodge House. Isn't that gorgeous? It is probably the most notable Second Empire piece of architecture in the region. Dodge was a surveyor, an engineer. He was involved with 16 railroad corporations in 6 countries. Of course, chief engineer of the Union Pacific, think Promontory Point and the Golden Spike. He built railroads in Cuba and Russia and France, and President Roosevelt, who particularly admired Dodge, said, "General, if you were 10 years younger, you'd be in charge of the Panama Canal." He's also a military hero. He was colonel of the Iowa 3rd. He fought at Pea Ridge in Arkansas, Tennessee, Vicksburg, Atlanta. He was in charge of the Department of Missouri, known as a graveyard of generals, but he made it work. He's also what we would call an Indian fighter, and he was a spy master. Indeed, some people believe that the Civil War was shortened to some extent, be it months or years, because of his important work. His beautiful home was built in 1869. Here's an image of the Dodge House campus, and has 14 rooms. And keep in mind, it was built, well, at that time was the frontier. It had hot and cold running water, and some of it was framed in St. Louis and shipped up the Missouri. And in many ways, historically, it's a community anchor, and we're known for Christmas. My last gig, I was a pastor for almost 20 years, and I love Jesus. I love Christmas. I just don't like decorating for Christmas. And so I said, when I retired, thank God I don't have to decorate for Christmas anymore. Well, we put up 27 Christmas trees last year. So the good Lord does have a sense of humor. The Dodge House is a place of delight and exploration. It is truly, and here we see an older image of it before the porch was enlarged by the daughters. It is truly a time capsule. Lots of historic homes you walk into them and they're empty, or they're filled with a few items. But especially on the first floor of the Dodge house, we enjoy thousands of original Dodge family items, many exactly in the place where they were when the Dodges lived there. So it allows us to travel back in time. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to all the people, particularly in the 1960s, that worked to make this happen. Because for 11 years, the Dodge house was apartments. The trustees of the Dodge estate offered it to the city of Council Bluffs. They said no, became apartments. 11 years later, the Historical Society purchased the house and turned it back over to the city of Council Bluffs. This time they said yes, and we have this jewel. So here's where our story begins, in Danvers, Massachusetts, not very far from Salem. Dodge's ancestors came over from England in 1632, and his future wife, her ancestors can be tracked to the Mayflower. He was inspired by a friend to attend Norwich University, and here is young Dodge as a cadet and student at Norwich University, which is still the oldest private military academy in the United States. And here's an image of one of the buildings. He graduated in 1848 and decide to go west and decide to use the engineering he had learned in college to engage in the railroads. And for a while, he worked for Peter Day in Peru. And completing the surveys for the Trans-Iowa Railroad, he decided to settle in Elkhorn, Nebraska. And here's an image painted by George Simons of Elkhorn, of his Elkhorn homestead. This would be the last homestead you'd see on your journey west. Now, why did Dodge decide to homestead here? Well, he had a pretty good idea where the Transcontinental Railroad might go, and he figured it'd go right through his property. Now, it didn't work out that way, thanks to Durant and other interesting people on the board of UP. Ended up going south. Eventually, Dodge would abandon his homestead because of conflicts with and among Native peoples. But still, it's quite remarkable to homestead out there. Now, when Dodge came to Council Bluffs first in 1854, he met George Simons, who had come to Council Bluffs a year earlier. Simons was hired by Dodge as his cook, and Simons provides us with more images of early Council Bluffs, Sioux City, and Des Moines than anyone else. And so it's a real blessing. If you got to see them on display at the Pace Center this past year, you were blessed. The last time all of George Simons' works were together was in 1962, and before that, 1921. The Dodge House has the largest collection of his paintings. Here's an image of Dodge's first home in Council Bluffs, which again was fabricated in St. Louis. If you were standing in the parking lot of Broadway Methodist Church and looked south, that's where Dodge's home would have been. And here's some other early images of Council Bluffs that I'm sure you've seen during this conference by George Simons. They really allow us to imagine what the city looked like in the 50s. And George Simons was a remarkable artist. And as his painting matured, we see more and more thoughtfulness in color and technique. I'd encourage you to visit the Dodge House to see, again, the largest collection of Simons paintings around. Of course, one of the most famous interactions Dodge ever had, and one that was most notable and important for Council Bluffs, was his meeting with soon to be President Lincoln. Not one, but many railroads would center here, Lincoln prophesized. Now, an associate of Lincoln's, Norman Judd, had bought some land from General Dodge. So early on, Dodge was a land speculator because he knew where he thought the Transcontinental Railroad would go. And so Judd bought a number of properties from the Dodge brothers, both Grenville and N.P. Dodge. And when Judd needed a loan from Lincoln, he put these properties in Council Bluffs as collateral. And so Lincoln was in St. Joseph and decided to come and inspect his properties. And during that time is the famous meeting at the Pacific Hotel, now a parking lot on Broadway, where Dodge said, "He shelled my woods." Lincoln got every bit of information that he could from Dodge about the Platte Valley route for a possible transcontinental railroad. It was in that moment that our future as Council Bluffs and Omaha as a major metropolitan and transportation area would happen. In fact, at one point we had 17 depots, and that's just the passenger depots. You think the planes flying over Council Bluffs are loud now? Imagine all those trains blowing their horns. You wouldn't get an hour of peace. Soon the Civil War came and Dodge was placed in charge of several divisions. Here is Camp Kirkwood, where they were trained. And here is the 3rd Iowa. Dodge is not portrayed in this picture. His first engagement of distinction was Pea Ridge, where 3 horses were shot out from under him, and the 4th horse was incredibly nervous. Now, we don't know if this is actually true. There's no other account, but Dodge says so. But Dodge, like many of us, began to curate the history of his life as he got older. But what he did at Pea Ridge that made a difference was that he made sure his men were rested. He worked hard to supply them, and they ended up with black coats, not blue uniforms. And he had them cut down trees in front of the enemy's troops. And indeed, the Confederate general would say, "Who are those black-coated devils?" He was referring to General Dodge's troop. I think that'd be a great name for a men's group affiliated with the Dodge House. I can't convince anyone else of that brilliant idea. So here's an image of Dodge and his staff at Corinth, known as the crossroads of the Confederacy, a very important locale. And around this time, he met Philip Henson. Now, Henson was a Southerner from Alabama, and he had Union sympathies, and he had experience as a federal Indian agent, had gone to Texas several times and met Sam Houston. And so he was appointed captain of Alabama State Militia and in charge of the Confederate Post Office. And during his trip to Texas, Sam Houston convinced him that he should be a spy for the Union against the Confederacy. And so shortly he found himself in Dodge's employ, and Dodge dispatched Henson to Vicksburg. And there, Henson brilliantly convinced General Pemberton that he was a loyal Yankee-hating rebel, and the general gave him a pass so he could come and go from Vicksburg as he pleased, which very quickly allowed us to complete the siege of Vicksburg and literally cut the Confederacy in two. General Dodge was so pleased he gave Henson a great big beautiful black stallion named Black Hawk. Later on, Henson became a double agent and was embedded with Nathan Bedford Forrest's Confederate cavalry. But he was suspected and arrested and was going to be shot. But then Henson said, "Hey, tomorrow there'll be an attack by the Union Army." And there was indeed an attack, not enough time for the Confederates to do anything about it, but enough time for Henson to have the Confederates believe he was on their side, and Henson's life was saved. Another anecdote, my friends. This is young Sam Davis. Sam Davis was a Tennessean and a member of the Southern Gentry. He was about 20 years old when he became a courier for the Confederates. Now, there's a difference between a spy and a courier. A courier has a letter from the general. A courier is often, at least in a partial uniform. A spy, rather, is completely hidden from recognition. And so when Davis is captured by Union folks, General Dodge is concerned because of the number of informational items Davis had in his shoes, including items stolen from Dodge's battlefield desk. And so Dodge gave young Sam Davis a choice: tell us who you work for and help us understand your spy network, or we will charge you as a spy and have you executed. And Sam Davis said, no. He said, I would rather die 1,000 deaths than betray a friend. And so illegally, because he was a courier, he did have a note from a Confederate general saying he was a courier, Dodge sentenced young Sam Davis to death. The night before his execution, Davis wrote to his mother, oh, how painful it is to write you, dear mother. I've got to die tomorrow, to be hanged by the Federals. Mother, do not grieve for me. I must bid you goodbye forever. Mother, I do not fear to die. Give my love to all. The officer in charge of the execution was so moved by Davis's youthful calm and demure that he seemed uncomfortable, and Davis said to his executioner, officer, I did my duty, now do yours. And years later, General Dodge would write on multiple occasions statements like this: I have often regretted the fate of this young man who could brave such a death when his life rested in his own hands. His mind was one of principle, though engaged in the wrong cause. And soon a statue was purchased and erected in honor of Sam Davis. You can see that here. And General Dodge was one of the donors. Today, though, some of the images of young Sam Davis are amongst those Confederate statues that are being critiqued, should they continue to stand or not. And so that's certainly an ongoing conversation. Dodge's firstborn daughter, Letty Dodge, was a tomboy and was definitely General Dodge's daughter. During Corinth, while Dodge was in Corinth, Dodge's wife and his two daughters were there, to include Letty. And during that time, a man named Alex Johnson joined up with the Union Army. 6 days later, he deserted, taking his rifle and his horse. And desertions were common on both sides, but what he did wrong was to then join some Confederate bandits. And as soon as he was captured by General Dodge's men, Dodge arranged a trial and sentenced him to death for the next day. Why the next day? Well, generally you would run up a death sentence up the ladder of authority, and President Lincoln tended to commute death sentences. And so Alex Johnson was sentenced to death. As the wagons went out carrying Johnson in his coffin, Letty hid in one of the wagons. And as the execution is about to begin, up pops the general's daughter. And the captain was aghast. And so Johnson had to sit on his coffin for some period of time while Letty was repatriated to her father. And Letty would get in all sorts of trouble. During the siege of Atlanta, Dodge was shot by a sniper in the head. In Des Moines, you can see his hat with the bullet hole in it, and here you can see the scalp on his head that is missing from that Confederate bullet. For a sense of time, I'm not going to tell you the story about this Currier and Ives image. You'll have to come to the Dodge house to hear about it. How's that for a teaser? One of the railroads that Dodge built was the Cuban Railway. Now, there were a number of railroads in Cuba, but on the west side, this one was built on the east side of Cuba, opened it up, and the railroad also began to engage in sugar plantations and refinement. So a total vertical monopoly. This kept Cubans poor, particularly in East Cuba, and led to all of that income being going to the United States. And so some say with I believe some accuracy that the Cuban Revolution that would happen in the 50s, General Dodge is partly responsible for, because he created an economy in the eastern half of Cuba that didn't benefit hardly any Cubans, only the rich. A couple more anecdotes, and then I'll have the courtesy to quit. Now, when we read the biographies of Sherman and Grant, Dodge isn't mentioned much, but when we read personal correspondence, Sherman, Dodge, and Grant were best friends. It's the year 1877, and both Dodge and Grant are spending time in Paris. Grant was almost a father to Dodge. Grant worked hard to get Dodge promoted. He worked hard to make sure that his battles against Durant, when Dodge was the chief engineer of the Union Pacific, would be victorious for Dodge. And Grant had a difficult time. One of his sons, named Ulysses, was involved in a Ponzi scheme, and that was a financial wound from which Grant would never recover. Grant wrote Dodge as he came close to death because of cancer. "I am sorry to trouble you, and would not, but for the circumstances under which I am placed. Since my injury," referring to his cancer, "nearly a year ago, I have grown very weak. A sore throat of 6 months standing has given me much trouble. I think a visit to the hot springs would do me good. Can you provide me with your railroad car?" And Dodge said, "Of course, but it's a journey that Grant would never get to take." But Dodge was the grand marshal, and that's what this painting represents, of the mausoleum built in honor of General Grant. And you can see this picture in the Secretary of State's office in Des Moines. It is 12 by 8. And Dodge would go on to make sure that the other son of General Grant received a promotion. All right. I want you to invite you, my friends, to visit the Dodge House again, or for the first time. In October, we're going to have a brand new orientation video. We're preparing to redo the porch of the Bersham House, and we have a number of new items being accessioned. Remember, the General Dodge House is our time capsule, and we are, as always, at your service. Thank you.